Los Angeles, 1969. The city breathed differently at night, slower, deeper, like a man who had finally stopped pretending. The Santa Ana winds had been pushing warm air through the canyons all evening, rattling palm trees and lifting the smell of engine oil and jasmine into something almost cinematic. The kind of night that feels, even while you're living it, like it belongs in a film. A black sports car moved through the streets of West Hollywood at a measured pace. Not fast, not slow, deliberate, the way its driver did everything. Behind the wheel sat a man who was, at that precise moment, simultaneously one of the most recognized faces in Asia and one of the most overlooked men in Hollywood. A man who had spent the last decade proving himself to a world that kept asking him to prove himself again. A man who had been told, more times than he could count, that he was too Chinese for American audiences, too American for Chinese ones, too small, too intense, too different, and who had responded to every single one of those dismissals by becoming more precisely, more completely, and more unapologetically himself. His name was Bruce Lee, and in approximately 12 seconds, a uniformed LAPD officer was going to walk up to his driver's side window, look him in the eyes, and have no idea who he was. What happened in those 12 seconds was not a fight, not a demonstration, not a performance. It was something rarer than any of those things. It was the moment a legend revealed himself not through power, but through presence. Stay with this story, because what the officer said afterward, he never stopped saying for the rest of his life. To understand what happened on that Los Angeles road on that particular evening, you first need to understand who was sitting behind that steering wheel. Not the icon, not the poster on 10 million walls, not the mythological figure that history eventually made him. The man, the actual, complicated, brilliant, restless, profoundly human man named Bruce Lee. He had been born in San Francisco on November 27, 1940, in the Hour of the Dragon, a detail his father, the Cantonese opera star Lee Hoi-chuen, noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed in omens. The family returned to Hong Kong when Bruce was 3 months old, and it was there, in the crowded, electrically alive streets of Kowloon, that the boy who would become a legend first learned how to move through a world that was not designed to accommodate him. He was never still. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not as an adult. His mother, Grace Lee, once described him as a boy who seemed to be running even when he was standing. His childhood was kinetic in every sense. He studied Wing Chun Kung Fu under the legendary Ip Man, danced the Cha-Cha competitively, and won the 1958 Crown Colony Cha-Cha Championship, a fact that delighted him for reasons that had nothing to do with ego. Street fought with a frequency that alarmed his parents and consumed books with the same appetite that he brought to physical training. Philosophy, psychology, physics. He read across disciplines the way other people breathed across rooms, naturally, necessarily, without effort. By the time he arrived in the United States at 18 years old, carrying little more than $100 and a ferocious sense of purpose, Bruce Lee was already something that most people only become after decades of living. He was completely, utterly himself. The world had not yet caught up to him. It rarely does with people like that. The years that followed his arrival in America were not easy ones, and this is important, because the Bruce Lee sitting in that car in 1969 was not the triumphant icon of later years. He was a man in the middle of a fight that had nothing to do with physical combat. He was a man fighting for the right to be seen accurately in a country that had decided at an institutional level that faces like his did not belong at the center of stories. Hollywood had made its position clear. When Bruce Lee created and pitched the concept for the television series that would eventually become Kung Fu, studio executives nodded, smiled, expressed admiration, and then gave the lead role to David Carradine, a white actor, on the grounds that American audiences would not accept a Chinese lead. The industry logic was impeccable from the inside and monstrous from the outside, the way so many forms of discrimination are. Bruce Lee had heard the decision with the stillness he brought to everything he found genuinely enraging, and he had made a private decision in that stillness that those who knew him well recognized immediately. He was not going to argue. He was going to build something so undeniable that the argument would become irrelevant. But in 1969, that building was still in progress. The foundation was being poured. He had, by this point, already left a significant mark on the martial arts world in America. His school in Los Angeles, among several he had established, was quietly legendary among those who knew where to look. He had trained celebrities. He had appeared in The Green Hornet as Kato, playing the role with such natural magnetism that viewers frequently told him Kato was more compelling than the show's nominal hero. He was teaching privately, writing constantly in the notebooks he carried everywhere, developing Jeet Kune Do, the philosophy of combat he was evolving from a synthesis of Wing Chun, boxing, fencing, philosophy, and the specific kind of intelligence that refuses to stop asking questions. He drove a car the way he did everything else, with attention. His hands on the wheel were hands that had broken boards, redirected punches traveling at speeds that instruments struggled to measure, performed movements that the human eye genuinely could not track in real time. But right now, those hands were simply steering. The engine hummed. The city passed on either side like a film unspooling, all neon and shadow and the occasional brilliant white of a streetlight illuminating a billboard, a pedestrian, a stop sign. He was thinking, almost certainly. Bruce Lee was always thinking. His wife Linda later described his mind as something that never fully rested, not in a troubled way, but in the way of a machine that had been built to run and found idleness physically uncomfortable. He might have been composing a note to himself about training. He might have been turning over a passage from one of the books currently stacked on his nightstand. He was reading Krishnamurti at this period, and the Indian philosopher's ideas about perception, freedom, and the destruction of psychological conditioning were producing the kind of intellectual excitement in him that he usually associated with discovering a new fighting technique. He did not see the patrol car until its lights came on behind him, blue and red, pulsing in his rearview mirror, the specific declarative language of authority in the United States of America, 1969. Pull over, stop, wait. Bruce Lee pulled over. He stopped. He waited. And into this perfectly ordinary, perfectly unremarkable moment, the kind of moment that happens to millions of people every year in this country, walked a young LAPD officer with a clipboard, a flashlight, and absolutely no idea what he was about to experience. There is a version of Bruce Lee that the world loves most, the one frozen in mid-kick, suspended above the ground, every muscle articulating something between violence and geometry. That image is real. It is also incomplete. Because the Bruce Lee who sat quietly at the side of a Los Angeles road that evening was not primarily a fighter. He was primarily a thinker who had chosen combat as his medium, the way another man of his temperament might have chosen mathematics or music or architecture. Understanding this requires going back, not to the famous fights or the celebrated films, but to a quieter, more private chapter, the years between his arrival in America and the moment Hollywood finally reluctantly took notice. The years of the intermediate Bruce Lee, the one who was becoming. When he first arrived in Seattle in 1959, Bruce Lee was 18 years old and carrying the particular combination of supreme confidence and financial poverty that tends to produce either great men or broken ones, depending on what the world does with them. He enrolled at the University of Washington, studied philosophy, supported himself by teaching martial arts in the parking lot of a restaurant he worked at, and began developing the ideas that would eventually crystallize into Jeet Kune Do. His students in those early Seattle years remember a teacher unlike any they had encountered, someone who asked questions more than he issued instructions, who was as interested in why a technique worked as in whether it worked, and who possessed a quality of focused attention when he looked at you that made people feel, uncomfortably and wonderfully, that they were being truly seen. He met Linda Emery in Seattle in 1963. She was a student in his martial arts class, blonde and precise and possessed of a stillness that complemented and balanced his restlessness. They married the following year over the explicit objections of Linda's mother and the implicit disapproval of a society that had not yet adjusted to the idea of interracial marriage as something other than scandal. Bruce Lee met that disapproval with the same response he met every form of external limitation, with a slight shift of his chin and the quiet, permanent decision to proceed. They moved to Los Angeles. They built a life. They had a son, Brandon, in 1965, and the arrival of fatherhood did something unexpected to Bruce Lee. It deepened him. People who knew him in the years before Brandon described a man who was brilliant, but sometimes electric in an unsettling way, all compressed energy and borderline impatience. People who knew him after described someone who had found an additional dimension. A man who had always moved through the world with extraordinary speed had discovered in fatherhood the particular power of slowing down. His notebooks from this period are remarkable documents. They read like the journals of a Renaissance figure. Philosophy, combat theory, training schedules, fragments of poetry, lists of books, dietary observations, reflections on the nature of consciousness, diagrams of footwork patterns, copied passages from Lao Tzu and Descartes and Hemingway sitting on the same page without apparent contradiction. He was building something, not a fighting system exactly, or not only that. He was building a complete philosophy of human performance rooted in the martial arts but extending far beyond them. A philosophy whose central argument was this, that the highest form of any skill is not technique but freedom. The freedom to respond to what is actually happening rather than to what you expected to happen. This idea, formlessness, adaptability, the abandonment of rigid systems in favor of living response, was the heart of Jeet Kune Do. And it was also, whether he articulated it this way or not, the heart of who Bruce Lee was as a human being. He did not fit categories, not racial categories, not cultural ones, not the neat boxes that the entertainment industry wanted to sort him into. He was Chinese and American. He was a philosopher and a fighter. He was a devoted father, and a man whose ambition was large enough to make people uncomfortable. He was humble about technique and utterly uncompromising about principle. He defied the logic of either-or, and in doing so, he made people who needed either-or logic to feel safe deeply, reflexively uneasy. Hollywood's rejection of him as a lead actor was not simply racism, though it was certainly that. It was also the specific discomfort of an industry built on type, confronting a man who could not be typed. He was, in every sense, uncastable, because the role he was actually suited for was one that did not yet exist. He would have to create it. In 1969, that creation was underway. He had begun conversations about a film project that would eventually become The Big Boss, his first leading role and the beginning of the most compressed, volcanic, transformative, creative period of his life. He did not know yet how little time remained. None of us ever do. What he knew, driving through Los Angeles that night, was that he had survived everything the world had thrown at him so far. The dismissals, the rejections, the years of being told that his dream was geographically and demographically impossible. He had survived all of it not by fighting it directly, but by doing what water does, finding the path through, wearing away the resistance with persistence rather than force. He was 30 years old. He was at the precise intersection of becoming and being, old enough to have acquired wisdom, young enough to still be lit from within by the fire that wisdom in lesser men eventually banks down to embers. The patrol car lights pulsed in his mirror. He pulled over. He was ready for whatever came next. He always was. The officer's name was Robert Callan. He was 26 years old, 3 years into his service with the LAPD, and possessed of the particular manner that young officers in that era often cultivated, a deliberate, unhurried authority, the physical language of a man who had been given institutional weight and was learning how to carry it without dropping it. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was doing his job on an ordinary Tuesday evening in a city that had, in recent years, given officers considerable reason to remain vigilant, and he approached the black sports car with the standard professional attention that the situation warranted. He did not recognize the driver. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In Hong Kong, at this precise point in history, Bruce Lee was already approaching the status of a cultural phenomenon, the kind of recognition that made it impossible to walk through certain neighborhoods without stopping traffic. In the American martial arts community, his name was spoken with a reverence usually reserved for historical figures. Among the small but devoted audience of the Green Hornet, he was the show's most memorable presence. But to Robert Callan, a young police officer going about his Tuesday night rounds in West Hollywood, the man in the black sports car was simply a driver who had made a rolling stop at an intersection when the traffic signal was against him. Callan tapped on the window with 2 knuckles, the standard knock, the practiced professional sound of authority requesting acknowledgement. The window came down. And in the moment that followed, in the space of those 12 seconds, something happened that Robert Callan would spend the next several decades attempting to describe to people who had not been there. It was not what Bruce Lee said. It was not what Bruce Lee did. It was something that exists in a category that language handles poorly, the specific quality of a person's presence in a moment of unexpected stillness. Most people, when stopped by a police officer, shift into a performance of innocence or compliance or careful neutrality. The face does something managed and deliberate. The body language speaks the language of someone being observed and responding to observation. Bruce Lee did none of this. He looked up at Officer Callan with an expression of complete, undefended attention. Not defiance, not submission. Attention, the pure, undivided kind that most people spend their entire lives failing to offer to anyone, including themselves. His eyes were dark and entirely still, and what they communicated, without words, was something Callan later described as, "I felt like he already knew whatever I was going to say, and he was fine with it." "Good evening, officer," Bruce Lee said. His voice was calm and precisely modulated, not the voice of a man performing calmness, but of a man who was actually calm. The distinction is audible, always, to anyone paying close enough attention. Callan asked for his license and registration, standard, procedural, the architecture of a minor traffic stop in 1969 Los Angeles. Bruce Lee produced both without searching for them, without fumbling, without the small comedy of pockets and compartments that most people perform in this situation. Smoothly, as if he had already known this moment was coming and had placed both documents in the precise location where they would be immediately retrievable. Callan took the license, looked at it, looked back at the driver, and something shifted. Because on that driver's license, in the clean printed font of the California Department of Motor Vehicles, was a name, Bruce Lee. And as that name moved from the card to his eye to whatever filing system the human brain maintains for cultural references and half-remembered images, Robert Callan experienced the specific neurological event that has no clinical name, but that everyone has felt. The sudden electric reorganization of perception when you realize that the ordinary thing in front of you is not ordinary at all. Kato, that was the first connection that arrived. The Green Hornet, the character that everyone who watched the show talked about. Not the hero, but the sidekick who moved like something from another dimension of human capability. Callan had watched the show. His younger brother had watched it obsessively, had imitated Kato's kicks in the backyard with the committed clumsiness of a 10-year-old who had seen something genuinely amazing and was trying to reconstruct it from memory. He looked at the man in the car, he looked at the license, he looked at the man again. "Are you?" he began, and then stopped because the sentence felt suddenly, embarrassingly obvious. The man looking back at him with that quality of complete, untroubled stillness was self-evidently exactly who the license said he was. "Yes," said Bruce Lee simply, not with amusement, not with the knowing smile of a celebrity accustomed to being recognized and performing graciousness about it. Simply yes, the way you confirm a fact that was never in serious doubt. Callan stood at the window of that car for a moment that he later described as one of the most disorienting of his professional life, not because anything threatening had happened, but because the precise opposite had. He had approached a traffic stop with the full architecture of official authority, and the man inside the car had somehow, without saying anything particularly remarkable, without doing anything demonstrable, shifted the entire gravitational center of the interaction. He was not intimidated by Bruce Lee. That is important. It was not fear or awe that reorganized the moment. It was recognition, the specific human recognition of being in the presence of someone who is operating at a frequency that most people only theorize about. A person who has done the work, all of the work, and become something that routine interactions cannot diminish or contain. "I'm sorry to have stopped you, Mr. Lee," Callan said, and he meant it in more ways than he could have articulated standing at the side of that road. He handed back the license, and then, because he was 26 years old and human, and the moment demanded something, he asked. The autograph request, when it came, arrived with the slightly embarrassed directness of a man who had decided that dignity was less important than honesty. Officer Robert Callan reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket, the pocket where officers of that era kept their citation books, their pens, the administrative instruments of their authority, and produced a small notepad. Not a citation pad, a personal notepad, the kind carried not for professional purposes but for the notes a person makes for themselves. Grocery lists, phone numbers, the fragments of thought that a man does not trust himself to remember without writing down. He held it out. Bruce Lee looked at the notepad, then at the officer, and then, with a quality of attention that Callan would spend years trying to describe accurately, he smiled, not the performance smile of a celebrity operating on automatic. A real smile. The kind that changes the eyes first and reaches the mouth second, the kind that communicates genuine warmth rather than the management of a social situation. He took the notepad, he took the pen, and he wrote. What exactly he wrote has been reported differently in different accounts of that evening. The nature of oral history is that details shift and settle and shift again as the years accumulate. What Callan consistently maintained in every conversation about that night that his family later recounted was that Bruce Lee did not simply sign his name. He wrote something, a line, a sentence, a fragment of thought that Callan described as feeling, when he read it, like something that had been written specifically for him rather than in response to a generic autograph request. Some accounts suggest it was a line from the Tao Te Ching, which Bruce Lee had been studying intensively during this period. Others suggest it was something original, one of the aphorisms that populated his notebooks during these years, the same notebooks that would eventually become source material for scholars and biographers trying to understand how a man could be simultaneously so physically extraordinary and so intellectually alive. One family member who heard Callan tell the story in the mid-1990s recalled him quoting the written line as something close to, "The man who can adapt to anything is the man who fears nothing." Whether those were the precise words or a memory's reconstruction of them, the essence of what Callan took away from that notepad was consistent across every telling. It was not a signature, it was a gift. He stood at the side of that road for a moment after Bruce Lee handed back the notepad, and he did something that 26-year-old LAPD officers in 1969 were not, in the ordinary run of their professional lives, given much occasion to do. He stood still. He read what had been written, and something in the reading of it, something in the combination of where he was and what he held in his hand, and the quality of the man who had just put ink to paper with that particular unhurried intention, produced in him an emotion he was never entirely able to name. Not awe, exactly. Callan was not the kind of man who used that word comfortably about anything other than natural phenomena. Not gratitude, though gratitude was part of it. Something closer perhaps to the feeling of having accidentally walked into a room where something important was happening and having the extraordinary good fortune to be allowed to stay. Bruce Lee's window went up. The engine turned. The black sports car pulled away from the curb with the same measured, deliberate pace at which it had arrived, as if the entire episode had been no more and no less significant than any other moment in an evening full of moments, all of them equally worthy of full attention, none of them requiring drama or performance or the manufacture of significance. Callan watched the taillights until they turned the corner. He stood at the side of that road for another full minute after the car disappeared. He later told his son that this was the minute he spent trying to understand what had just happened. Not the mechanics of it, which were perfectly clear, but the quality of it. Why had 12 seconds of eye contact and a single line of handwriting left him feeling as though he had encountered something he would be thinking about for years? The answer, which came to him not in a rush, but slowly, the way answers to the better questions tend to arrive, was this. Most people, when caught in an uncomfortable situation, pulled over by police, confronted by authority, placed in a position of social vulnerability, shrink. Not necessarily in size, but in self. They become smaller versions of who they normally are, more managed, more defended, more careful. The situation reduces them. Bruce Lee had not been reduced by that situation by a single fraction. He had been, throughout those 12 seconds and the minutes that followed, entirely himself, not performing himself, being himself, with the same completeness and the same quality of presence that he brought, Callan somehow sensed, to everything he did, teaching martial arts, writing in his notebooks, walking into a room, driving through a city at night, being pulled over by a police officer who did not know his name. It was all the same. That was the thing. The man behind the wheel of that car did not have a public self and a private self, a famous self and an ordinary self, an impressive self for important moments and a reduced self for unimportant ones. He had one self. Consistent, complete, unreduced by circumstance or audience or the absence of audience. Callan kept the notepad. He kept it in a drawer beside his bed for the remainder of his career, and when his son was old enough to ask about it, old enough to understand both who Bruce Lee was and why a piece of paper with his handwriting deserved a place of quiet honor beside a man's bed, Callan told him the story, the black car, the Tuesday evening, the 12 seconds, the smile that started in the eyes, and the line of writing that said, more clearly than any biography or documentary or tribute ever would, exactly what kind of man Bruce Lee was when nobody was watching, the same kind he was when everybody was. There is a version of greatness that announces itself loudly, that requires an audience, a stage, a moment of high drama to become visible. The world is full of this kind of greatness, and we are trained from childhood to recognize it. The trophy raised, the crowd erupting, the climactic moment where excellence proves itself to the maximum number of witnesses possible. And then there is another kind, the kind that does not require a stage. The kind that exists in a car pulled over at the side of a Los Angeles road on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. The kind that shows up in 12 seconds of eye contact with a stranger who does not know your name and leaves that stranger standing at the side of the road a minute after you've driven away, trying to understand why the encounter felt like it mattered. Bruce Lee understood something that most people spend their entire lives circling without landing on. That character is not something you perform for audiences. It is something you are in the absence of them. The test of who you actually are is not the championship bout or the film premiere or the moment when the world's eyes are on you and the stakes are at their highest. The test is the Tuesday evening, the traffic stop, the ordinary interaction with a stranger who has no particular reason to be impressed by you and every official reason to be an inconvenience. He passed that test not by being extraordinary. He passed it by being consistent, by bringing to a minor traffic stop on a Los Angeles road the same quality of presence, the same undivided attention, the same unhurried authenticity that he brought to everything else, by refusing, even in a moment that asked nothing of him, to be less than himself. In his notebooks, Bruce Lee wrote, "Always be yourself, express yourself, have faith in yourself, do not go out and look for a successful personality and duplicate it." He wrote those words as instruction for others. But the Tuesday evening on that Los Angeles road suggests he had long since stopped needing to write them as instruction for himself. He had simply become them. Officer Callan asked for an autograph that night. What he actually received was something rarer, evidence that the man whose name he had just read on a California driver's license was not a performance, not a constructed public identity assembled from ambition and discipline and the strategic management of reputation. He was simply, completely, irreducibly himself. And that, more than any fight, more than any film, more than any feat of physical brilliance that no camera was fast enough to capture faithfully, is the most enduring thing Bruce Lee left behind, not the legend, the man inside it. Unchanged, unhurried, and entirely present, even at the side of a road, even in 12 seconds, even when nobody knew who he was.